like I was always interested in history and archaeology, ancient civilizations, paranormal stuff, UFOs, psychic phenomenon, all that kind of stuff. And I was really interested to travel around the world too. I was a technical climber for a while, and I grew up right around a ski resort as well. And wanted to really kind of hit the road. I'd grown up on a heavy dose of Johnny Quest cartoons and kung fu, TV shows and stuff. And like so many people, I really wanted to. And my parents had traveled a lot too. And so as a kid, we'd been to the pyramids of Mexico City and to Stonehenge and to Greece and Turkey and stuff. And so I had this desire to really travel around the world, and I was very interested in things like Tibet and the Himalayas, and I was a climber. But I also, wanted to go to Egypt and see all the interesting stuff around. And I was early on interested in Atlantis and stuff too. And that got me going. And I studied Mandarin Chinese at the University of Montana. And then one day, our Chinese professor, who was a Catholic priest, Father Wong, read a note to our class saying that one of his students was teaching English in Taiwan, and that if any of his students wanted to go to Taiwan and be English teachers and stuff, this was back in the mid-'70s, come up and talk to me after class. And I went right up to Father Wong after class that day, and I said, yeah, that's what I want to do. I want to go to Taiwan and travel around the world, teach English, whatever. And I began doing that. And that got me to the Himalayas and to India, and eventually I ended up across the Middle East and to Israel, and went to Egypt and down to Sudan. Ended up traveling for several years through Africa. I'm one of the only tourists who's probably ever been to Somalia. And and I write about that in my books, and a lot of my travels and things are in my books on lost cities and ancient mysteries. So that said, we'll get going, and we'll first run through some of the more interesting things about the Southwest. And there's a ton of stuff in my book. I'm only going to really touch on 3 things. And then we'll do the technology of the gods presentation. So let's see, I'm going to see if this works. Yeah, here we go. So this has been my new book, Lost Cities and Ancient Mysteries of the Southwest. Just came out a few months ago. One of the early chapters in this book is about a really strange place near Socorro, New Mexico, called Victorio Peak. And it's named after this Mescalero Apache chief named Victorio. Victorio, relatively famous Apache chief, not as famous as, I say, Geronimo or Cochise. He ran around mainly southern New Mexico and West Texas, and also El Paso, Sonora area. In fact, he was chased eventually by the Buffalo Soldiers, who were after him because he, like a lot of Apache war chiefs, were on the warpath. They would raid stagecoaches and settlers, and it made the Southwest the dangerous place that it was back then. And the Buffalo Soldiers eventually did corner Victorio down in Chihuahua, Mexico. And then the Mexican army got involved too, and then they killed him. So then, he was basically dead by the turn of the century, Victorio, and then the story just for 30 years, not really much happens until this guy comes along, and his name is Doc Noss, and he was part American Indian and was originally from Oklahoma, and he moved to Hatch, New Mexico in the 1920s. And he was a podiatrist. He was supposedly a foot doctor. He was kind of a jack of all trades. And he was married to a gal named Ova Noss. And one day they all went hunting. And this is the area that we're talking about right here. Hatch, New Mexico, Truth or Consequences, Socorro up here. And then, Roswell's, say, right over here. And this place. It's called Victorio Peak. And they went hunting around this peak. Here's a picture of it. It's kind of a nondescript volcanic mountain. And they were hunting in this area, and Doc Noss got up near the top, looking for some antelope or something, and it started to rain. So he took shelter in what was kind of a cavern up at the top, somewhere right up in here. And what he noticed was, as he got up inside this cavern, almost near the top of this peak, was that there was a big stone on the floor of this cavern. And this stone looked like it had been kind of worked a little bit. And it was a little kind of an unusual stone. So he moved this stone out of the way. And what it was covering this shaft. It went straight down into this mountain. And this is him right here. And this is now kind of late 30s. And he's standing at the very top of the mountains, right up here. And he's kind of standing here and then inside the shaft. And this was an entrance into what was really a hollow mountain. And in fact, what turns out to be inside this mountain was an ancient mine that the Jesuits had worked. It's a hollow volcanic mountain. There's a river down at the bottom of this. Here's a picture of the shaft. There's a river down here. There were various different shafts. Eventually, as he got down inside it, here's another diagram. The tunnel leveled out, and then there was a bunch of rooms. There was a river going through, and then there was gold bars stacked up inside of this cavern. And it was like $1 billion in gold. And it had already been worked. And in fact, where exactly all this gold came from, kind of a gold mine, this river that was flowing underground had like beaches of gold. And there's a lot of other stories in the Southwest of places like this, including the cocoa leaf mine, which is in Nevada, which is a similar thing, where there's this river of gold underground. Now, one of the things that made it really difficult for them, so basically Doc Noss and his wife they discovered what was one of the greatest treasures ever discovered. And it was $1 billion in gold, ready to go. But they had some serious problems, and that is that at that time in the United States, it was illegal to own gold. And this is a problem too with lost treasure in general. And I've always been interested in lost cities, ancient mysteries, and ghost towns, lost mines, and lost treasure. You don't hear about lost treasure that much being discovered because you would be kind of foolish to actually talk about it. And you're going to want to probably keep it a secret. And that's what they did. And back then, it was actually illegal to own gold. And yeah, you would go to prison, really, if you suddenly. But they tried different things. Like they tried to stake a claim on this place. They tried to dynamite part of it so they could get down into it more easily. Doc Noss became very suspicious. What he would do to try and get rid of some of this gold was he would take it to Mexico, like to El Paso or something. And in Mexico at pawn shops and stuff, he could sell that gold. But he couldn't do that in the United States. By the way, it was President Nixon who in 1973 made it legal again to own gold in the United States. Up until that time, you could not own like gold bars and things like that. You could own gold coins. And you could own gold that had a numismatic value, but not gold bars and things. Because he was very suspicious, he was trying to get people to help him and move all this gold out of Victorio Peak, but he was working around with the wrong guys, and he was shot and killed in Hatch, New Mexico, like 1941, the beginning of World War II, and so he was dead. He had buried parts of the gold. He had brought it out from the mountain. By the way, down inside this treasure trove, this Apache chief, Victorio, he actually found bodies of people who had been chained to the walls and stuff like that and tortured. It's really something out of some movie. This is some of the gold that supposedly he had. He had made a deal with this mysterious guy. It was the only known photo of him, a guy named Fred Drolt. He was a pilot. He was some kind of Vietnam veteran. He was probably, we think now, maybe like a CIA agent or something. He was kind of the archetypal one-armed man which was made so famous during the Fugitive TV show, if you know that, where David Jansen was constantly looking for the one-armed man who killed his wife and stuff. This guy was piloting this plane, and they were flying a plane into Victorio Peak. there in the 1940s to try and get the gold out, and they were going to fly to Mexico, but there was a crash there. They didn't trust each other, and then later, Doc Noss was shot and killed. Noss had divorced his wife, and he was something of a playboy in the 30s and 40s. And so he actually remarried, and that created a lot of problems for any kind of ownership of Victorio Peak and stuff. She claimed the ownership, and she just died recently, but these were some of the artifacts that she said had come out of Victorio Peak and were part of it. Here's a map, again, of Victorio Peak. Now, what happened to Victorio Peak and all this stuff is pretty interesting, is that the Army literally swallowed up this area, which is called Timbrillo Basin. And so the area around White Sands and Alamogordo and essentially Roswell and stuff expanded, and it then took over Victorio Peak, and so it became part of this Army base. Later, in the 1960s, apparently, I mean, all the gold and stuff was still inside this mountain because part of it had collapsed in this dynamiting. So, but then what happened was the Army decided apparently they were going to get the gold, and they built a road up to it and bulldozed it, and they even put an iron door, to cover the entrance to this mountain. Now later in the 1970s, late 70s, it became pretty famous briefly, where Bill Richardson, who was governor of New Mexico then at that time too, and this is Dan Rather right here. What happened was the people who were involved with Ova Noss and her family, they got together with the state of New Mexico to sue the U.S. Army in order to recover all this gold. And the state of New Mexico's involvement was basically this. They basically said to the U.S. Army, they said, well, if there's gold inside that mountain, then that belongs to the state of New Mexico, not to the U.S. Army. And this became this big legal battle. And the U.S. Army's whole point was, what gold? We don't know about some gold in some mountain there, But it was now part of this Army base. So, and even today, you cannot go to this place. So for a while, they got a court injunction. They brought Ova Noss here. Here are some soldiers helping her to go back to the mountain, her mountain full of gold and stuff like that. And they showed her the iron door that they'd put on it and everything, and said, well, there's nothing in there. You don't need to go in there. And they never did get to go back inside. And the whole thing really came to naught, but is still going on today. By the way, there's evidence, as bizarre as it gets, is that Lyndon Johnson was somehow involved in this and got some of this gold. And it's so much gold that came out of this mountain. I mean, they've said, it could have bought and sold entire countries with this amount of super treasure. So here's kind of here's cars and stuff like that. This is all now in the Army. There's a photo taken like 1977. They're all gonna go up here, and they're gonna go up to the top, and they're gonna see the iron door and stuff like that. So the idea, what's so interesting here with Victorio Peak and stuff, is that hollow mountains full of gold and incredible lost treasure absolutely exists. There's no question about it. So now, the interesting story of the Egyptians in the Grand Canyon. In 1909, the Phoenix Gazette did this whole several-page story about a Smithsonian institution archaeologist. His name was Jordan. It was an explorer. His name was Kincaid. He was going down the Grand Canyon. Kincaid looked up and thought he saw allegedly some kind of door and slag coming out of it, thinking it was an old mine. He says he went up inside it. Inside this was these rock-cut vaults going deep inside, like the cliffs of the Grand Canyon. And then he claimed that inside it were all these mummies. There were all these artifacts, including what seemed to be Egyptian-type artifacts and like Tibetan and Buddhist kind of things, things that would have maybe come from what we call the Cam people. in Vietnam who were, and Cam is also another word for Egypt. But they were doing this trans-Pacific kind of travel at the time. I won't get into all that right now. What I found out too, as I began researching the whole Egyptians and the Grand Canyon story, was that the old 60s movie, which was one of my favorite Westerns, called McKenna's Gold, with Gregory Peck and Omar Sharif and a whole bunch of other stars, was, I realized after researching it all that this movie was basically a fictionalized version of two famous Southwest treasure stories. One, the Adams Gold, or the Adams Diggings, which is actually more near Silver City and Reserve and Catron County kind of area of New Mexico, combined with the story of the Grand Canyon and the Egyptian stuff and all the other weird things. And that's kind of what they do in McKenna's Gold. They find this secret like canyon near the Grand Canyon, and it's a place with gold and stuff like that. That's a cool movie. I do recommend, if you're interested in this, maybe get that McKenna's Gold movie. This is a tomb in Egypt called KV39. I'm using this slide as an illustration of like what the Egyptians often did and what their rock-cut tombs were like, cut into solid rock. In Egypt, there's thousands of mummies have been discovered, but they're not found in pyramids. They're found in rock-cut tombs deep underground, like the Valley of the Kings, the Valley of the Queens. This is like where Tutankhamun and stuff like that was found. So, when you enter, just to show you how complicated these things are, you'll enter into like these vaults, but then there's all these, and they're cut through solid rock. They go down, and then you suddenly come to a room over here, or you can go another way. And there's another room cut into solid rock. So, this absolutely exists in Egypt. We know that, and in a sense, something like this is what's being described by the Phoenix Gazette article in 1909. Now, as I further research into all this, I found that there was this guy also who was somehow involved in this, and his name was Seth Tanner. Seth Tanner was a Mormon pioneer who had come down from Utah into the Grand Canyon and northern Arizona area. And he's actually a pretty famous guy in Grand Canyon lore and stuff. He pioneered a number of trails in the Grand Canyon. They're called today, one of the famous trails is called the Tanner Trail, and it's named after this guy. There's a secret canyon called Tanner Canyon. And he is a character in the McKenna's Gold movie, too. Where he actually plays the Adams in it. But really, the character in McKenna's Gold is clearly Seth Tanner because he's a blind man. He's been blinded. And this is what happened to Seth Tanner. It's the only known photo we know of him, taken like 1895 or something. And the story with this guy goes something like this, that he went around into a lot of remote areas of the Grand Canyon and also where the Little Colorado meets, and areas like Cameron, and Tuba City and stuff like that were the areas where he also lived. He apparently had a Hopi wife or a Navajo wife. It's not real clear with that. He apparently had several wives, as many Mormons did back then. But he saw something in the Grand Canyon. He was by himself, he discovered it, or somebody showed it to him, something secret in the Grand Canyon that he wasn't to see. And because he had seen this, and it was some kind of hidden cave and stuff in there, he had to die. But because he was married to a Hopi Indian gal, they didn't kill him, but they blinded him. And they got some kind of acid or something, and they put it in his eyes, and he was blinded from then. And they called him the Bear, and he became essentially an invalid because he was blind, but he still lived for some years. So it was clear that he had seen something in the Grand Canyon, something totally forbidden, and it was, he had to suffer for that and was punished. But we don't know what it was, and he never, ever said. In the Grand Canyon, particularly where the Little Colorado River meets the Grand Canyon, and that's its own canyon itself, the Little Colorado River Canyon, which, a lot of tourists kind of miss it because the Grand Canyon itself is so spectacular. Why go see this, secondarily spectacular canyon? So, but down in it, around at where the Little Colorado meets the Colorado River, is a couple of unusual things. One is this. This is supposedly the Sipapu of the Hopis, where they emerged from the underworld in the Grand Canyon. And this is in Hopi tradition, and other Pueblo Indians have this tradition that they emerged from underground during the last cataclysm. They had lived underground to be safe, and then they emerged out of the ground. And one of the stories, anyway, is that this is where they emerged from. And you cannot really go and see this. Photos of it are rare. It's supposedly this kind of volcanic dome or hotspot. It has a hole here. It's maybe like steam or something comes out. But the idea is that it is some entrance to like an underworld. Mummies were talked about in the Phoenix Gazette article of 1909. And that's very controversial in itself, because it's often said that, well, okay, the people around here didn't really mummify the dead. We don't really have mummies. One of the mysteries of Chaco Canyon in New Mexico is that they don't really find burial places. There's not graveyards there and things like that. They don't know, even though Chaco Canyon supposedly was like some major ceremonial place, they're baffled by not finding burial sites and things like that. But we do know that, in fact, a number of mummies have been found around the Southwest, including these ones in Utah. There's a roadside attraction down near Tombstone called The Thing. The Thing is a mummy, too. It's a mummy of a woman and a child. And there are areas in the Grand Canyon, if you're going down on a river raft or something like that, where you'll see curious things like doors and stuff like that would seem to go into back into the canyon walls and stuff. There are reports that there are areas like this, and they have big iron doors over it from the Park Service. Many parts of the Grand Canyon are off limits, and you cannot go there. Even to get permission to go to many parts of the Grand Canyon is very difficult and takes a long time. Grand Canyon area is very, very heavily controlled, especially today. And there's just tons and tons of unusual myths and legends that are associated, really, with the Grand Canyon. Then I was sent this thing as a slide by somebody, and this was a part of a 1900 stereo view slide. Those old, real early, turn of the century kind of Viewmaster slide things. And this guy had found it, and it was only one half of a stereo slide, so there would have been another one in stereo, but he only had one half of it. And it's from the Grand Canyon, and it shows this butte with what seems to be like this face here. This is part of the slide here. Let's see, I gotta go back. Here's go. Yeah, so the idea of it being a kind of a sphinx kind of thing. Here we go. This was somehow skipped over this one. All right, this is the stereo view slide right here. And here you see little instructions on the side for how to work your little stereo, view thing. And then here was this butte over here, and here's this face like a sphinx. And in fact, this was one of the other interesting things. We started researching this idea of this Egyptian, the Grand Canyon stuff. When you get a map of the Grand Canyon, all the names and stuff are all these Egyptian and Hindu and Buddhist names, Pyramid of Cheops, Buddha and Krishna pyramids, Shiva temple, stuff like that. And so here now was the idea that somehow some of the bluffs and things like that in the Grand Canyon were carved into faces, stuff like that, sphinxes. I've had some interesting correspondence with another guy in Colorado who also maintains that There's other areas in the southwest where huge Buddha statues were carved into rocks, like Canyon de Chelly and stuff like that are now so heavily weathered because it's sandstone that you can hardly, that you can just barely see like what they used to be. But it's true that in Asian stuff, the Buddhists and Hindus to a point would go out and carve giant statues of Buddha and stuff like that on the cliffs and things. That's really common, including the ones in Afghanistan that the Taliban were destroying and stuff. And they're exactly the same thing. So the whole idea, he thought too, the guy who sent it to me, that thing's over here, but he kind of circled this cave right in here. He felt that, which somehow coincidentally was also on this slide, the stereo view slide that had also with this Sphinx and stuff. So, and to be honest, I do not know exactly where this is. And a lot of the stuff seems to be around the north side of the Grand Canyon, but also where the Little Colorado does meet, the main Colorado. Also around the area of the Little Colorado Gorge is the Hopi sacred salt mines. And this also is an area you can't go to, and it's even though it's in the Grand Canyon, it's part of, it's kind of owned by the Hopis, really, because it's their ancient salt mines, and this is part of it. Salt mines were really important in the ancient world. Salt was money in the ancient world in a lot of places. Roman soldiers were paid in salt. Near Cusco in Peru, the Incas controlled an important salt mine there. And it was kind of like having your own mint in a sense. There's also a very important salt lake near Zuni that was also very famous. So here is, I'm going to see if I can get a little bit better focus here. There. All right, this is a map too, Lee's Ferry of the Grand Canyon. Here's the Little Colorado coming in. Cameron would be like here, be the modern road. The Little Colorado, the canyon of the Little Colorado starts right around Cameron, and then it runs up here, and then it meets the Colorado in this area. Tanner Trail, named after Seth Tanner, is kind of like right in here. And there's in this area, there are also some weird hidden canyons and stuff. One is called Tanner Canyon, and horse thieves supposedly went into this area. So, and this is also where the salt mine is, and the Sipapu. So, in many ways, I've often suspected that this area sort of has something to do with the so-called Egyptian catacombs and stuff in the Grand Canyon. By the way, also as far as lost treasure and gold goes, this Lee's Ferry was named after another Mormon explorer guy whose name was Lee, and there was an old gold mine associated with him. So yeah, you kind of wonder, there was gold in this area, and perhaps Lee's gold mine that was so famous might have had something to do with actually artifacts and other Egyptian things like that. Lee's Ferry in 1910 became a pretty big operation, but there was a mystery associated with it too, with all this gold and stuff like that. So here we are, a little bit of a blow up, the Little Colorado Gorge coming here, and here's the Grand Canyon, here's the Tanner Trail right in here. So somehow, particularly with the Seth Tanner, I felt was an important connection to this whole thing of the Egyptians in the Grand Canyon. So one of the things that has to do with right around this area was there used to be what was called the Homolovi Trail, which started at the Hopi Mesas, and it came down nearby Flagstaff and off the Mogollon Rim, and actually went apparently through Sycamore Canyon, which supposedly has also a lost pyramid in it. I don't know if you've ever heard that, but I mentioned in a book, and I'll show you a picture in a minute. But where the trail was ultimately going was Cottonwood, and near to the Adventures Unlimited bookstore there in Cottonwood. And that is the Tuzigoot ruins. And so Tuzigoot right here was a really unusual area and was a mining area. And then the trail then went on down to really Phoenix area and the Hohokam area. Now Tuzigoot, other areas around the Hopis. This is actually an old photograph of the Zuni Pueblo in New Mexico. And so, at that time, at the Hopi mesas, and then Zuni would have been the next closest pueblo going east. And what is important about particularly Zuni and the Hopi mesas, also to a point, it's the continental divide right there. And so right where Chaco Canyon is and Zuni and stuff, if you're coming from the Atlantic side up the Rio Grande and whatnot, and then up towards Albuquerque, and then towards Zuni. But as if you were coming also from the Colorado River and the Pacific side, this is where the rivers and everybody meets, and the trails met as well. And Zunis too were known to go to the Pacific Ocean and collect shells and trade that way. So they were oriented in a way to both directions, to both the Pacific and the Atlantic. All right, this is what Tuzigu looked like in 1971. Tuzigu was like this, and still today. You should visit it. It's like a castle up on a rock. But what was Tuzigu doing there? And actually, anthropologists don't know who built Tuzigu. Tuzigu was built by the Sinagua Indians, right? Well, who were they? Well, nobody knows. They're the Indians without water. I mean, yeah, it's just a name. I mean, they're nobody, in fact. But in fact, the people who built Tuzigu would have been related to, for sure, in my mind, the Hohokams, also the Hopis, and even with what was going on in the Grand Canyon, if that was some sacred area, if Buddhists and Egyptians and Hindus and other people were also making pilgrimages there. And the other thing about Tuzigu is that, and there was all these stories of this ancient mine, and it had different names. It was called the Mine of the Blue Mountains, of the Sierra Azul. It was sometimes called the Lost Apache Mine. But it was a very rich mine that even the early governors of New Mexico sought after. And so the early explorers who came out into this area, right where we are now, in Sedona and Conwood and whatnot, they came out here looking for this ancient mine of the Sierra Azul and of the Lost Apache Mine. Well, that ancient mine is Jerome. And Jerome and those mountains, that's the Sierra Azul. So Jerome itself, which is a famous mining town, and today a popular tourist town in Arizona, was already this ancient mine where rich copper and gold and stuff was coming out of it. And in fact, Jerome had a newspaper for a while as a mining town, boom town. And one of the early stories that got reprinted out of it was how they found mummies inside these mines. So the mines were already being worked. And in fact, here we are, William A. Clark, the founder of Clarkdale, and basically the owner of the early Jerome mines, became one of the wealthiest men in Arizona, founded his own town, and it's still there today. And but it was already an existing mine. It had been worked in ancient times, and even like the Aztecs and stuff had worked this mine. And that's part of the whole thing with a lot of lost treasure and ancient mines, and one reason why I'm particularly interested in it is that most modern mines and lost treasure often were ancient mines too, and had been worked, hundreds of years ago, even thousands of years ago. This is supposedly a photograph of this lost pyramid in Sycamore Canyon, which is not too far away. And the Homolovi Trail came down through that way. Sycamore Canyon is today a wilderness, and not many people go up in there. There are not roads, really. There are some trails. Even to get a good overlook of Sycamore Canyon, you have to kind of go way up by Williams and come down these dirt roads and then get to a giant overlook where you can kind of look down into the canyon. But that was more, today hardly anyone ever goes there, but in ancient times that was like the main road. This too, as I tried to decipher all this stuff that was going on in the Grand Canyon, in the Southwest, how it fit in with Egyptians and Buddhists and whoever. This is called Our Lady of Elche, and it was a statue found in Spain and in an archaeological dig. And it's often associated with Atlantis. And we reprinted a book, in fact, with this on the cover called Atlantis in Spain. And it's pretty unusual. There's this woman, she's here, she's dressed in these fine robes and stuff. And what's kind of interesting is she's wearing this unusual hairstyle of her hair's in like wheels on either side of her head. And that is a Hopi, Indian way of wearing your hair. And in fact, if you are an unmarried Hopi girl, you're supposed to wear your hair like this. I don't know if they do it anymore, probably not. But yeah, this was a signal that, yeah, you weren't married yet, and the young Hopi guys could court you and stuff like that. Here, she's wearing her hair like that. In the Star Wars movies, Princess Leia wears her hair like that too. Go figure. But you don't see people wearing their hair like that too much. And for me, especially when I see unusual things and styles, I usually think there's definitely some connections to that. The Hopis, by the way, also use boomerangs. And hunting, we often think of boomerangs as a Australian Aboriginal kind of a thing, but it's not really. Boomerangs are ancient hunting tool and weapon. Egyptians hunted with boomerangs. Boomerangs have been found in Florida and Poland and Denmark, of course Australia, down in Texas, the natives also there hunted with boomerangs, it's well known. Archaeologists don't like to make these connections with ancient peoples and stuff. So in Australia they're boomerangs, but in Southwest they're throwing sticks. Okay. And as a matter of fact, it's interesting to note here, and this gets back to the whole Egyptians in the Grand Canyon and stuff like that, that when Tutankhamun's tomb was opened up in the Valley of the Kings, there was an entire trunk of boomerangs in his tomb. I mean, Tutankhamun was a boomerang nut. He had and then those boomerangs are on display at the Cairo Museum today. So the idea too of like who, in a sense, could, say, disseminated boomerang technology around the world, and it may well actually be Egyptians who did that. All right, we'll get that out of the way. All right, we'll jump now to one of the last chapters in my Lost Cities, Ancient Mysteries Southwest book, which is a lot of stuff about Death Valley in California. When the Spanish first started exploring around California, they thought California was an island. And a lot of early maps of California area, like this 1850 map, yeah, California was a kind of a huge island. It wasn't connected, they thought, to the rest of North America, which seems a little bit odd today, since California is obviously part of North America. But why would the Spanish think it wasn't? Well, at that time, when the early Spanish were really starting to explore California and stuff, what they found was that the central part of California was still like a part of the ocean. And you had areas like the Salton Sea, which were huge, much bigger than it is today. Plus, as you went into the areas like Fresno and stuff, which would have been through the Golden Gate, then you entered into this huge lake system that was in central California. And yeah, well, and this is around Fresno, and this was a place that was like Tulare Lake. And in fact, California has been drying up for thousands of years, really, and it's still drying up today. But they thought, so early maps put like this big inland sea in California. Here was Quivira and Cibola and stuff like that. The Spanish were looking for 7 gold cities of Cibola. They were also looking for this grand Quivira place. European map makers thought, well, this Quivira must be around the shores of this big inland sea that's part of California, right? Well, yeah, where's that? So similarly, too, from 1830 Spanish map also showed in the Central Valley of California, around Fresno and stuff like that, huge lake systems. And it was all, it was drying up. Even on these lakes, they're gone now, but there were like 3-masted schooners and things like that sailing on these lakes. There was an interesting story, too, of an early aviator in the 20s who was flying through around the desert, around like Baker, California, and then Barstow kind of area, and saw a ship in the desert. And that ship was actually, just from the 1800s, and was like an old paddle wheel that used to go across this lake and take stuff out of mines, and then now it's just like the desert. So there's a lot of evidence to show that, that California in ancient times was so much different than it is today. So now we'll go to Death Valley and the whole weird mystery there, and a lot of it is associated with this guy here, Death Valley Scotty. And Death Valley Scotty was a really kind of strange, interesting guy, enigmatic. He was a prospector. He had ridden with Wild Bill Cody's Wild West Circus. He was from Kentucky, had come out west. This is his brother, Bill. Here's Scotty here, like 1920. For some reason, Scotty got involved in Death Valley, which at the time had the borax works. He was a prospector, something of a shyster, a wheeler dealer. He claimed, and other people did, that he had a source of gold. He had found these vaults, like in the Grand Canyon, but these were in Death Valley. We don't have very many photographs of these mummies, these ancient mummies that were found. In fact, maybe only this one. And this was this is like about an 8-foot woman. She's also holding a child right here. This mummified. It's a normal guy standing here. This was discovered in Bridal Veil Falls, California, which is just north of Death Valley. So this ancient giant mummy was also from like the Death Valley area and stuff. Around Death Valley too, the southern part is an area called Wingate Pass. That area today is also a military reservation. You can't go onto it like at Victorio Peak, where you cannot, there's no way you can go and to Victorio Peak now. There was a weird battle fought at Wingate Pass with Scotty and his brother, and Scotty was famous for, in Los Angeles at the time, this is the area of Wingate Pass. Other people and other stories, and they didn't all come from Scotty, who was very cagey about this, but other people would go in there. They would claim that they had gone into these underground rooms and vaults. They had found all these giants, artifacts, tables, and things like that, mummified remains of animals and of people, which is also what the Egyptians and stuff did. And it was all supposed to be around this area of Wingate Pass, but Scotty's castle is on the other side of Death Valley, which is all a huge area. So Wingate Pass is down around here. This is Death Valley right here. Scotty's castle is way up here at the other side. This is Wingate Pass, where a lot of people, and this area is a military reservation now. You cannot explore this. And it's, according to the stories, some of the most interesting stuff was somehow around in here. Other people maintained what they were saying in some of the stories was that there was evidence that Death Valley actually was this lake. And in fact, geologists call it Lake Manly, but they claim that there were windows and things like that and doorways in the mountains, and that there were tunnels cut through the rock in the mountains, and there would be occasional windows. And according to some of the reports, what they thought that was going on, the people who said they were inside it, was that it was the shore of the lake, but it would have been way up on the mountains. Today there's no water in Death Valley. But at some time in the future, this was a lake that was 300 feet deep or even 600 feet deep or something. And that there would actually be docks up, on the mountains, way up in the mountains and stuff like that, where people would dock up their ancient ships and then go inside the mountains. Okay, so, the whole thing gets pretty weird. Death Valley Scotty later teamed up with a Chicago insurance guy named Al Johnson. The story goes that he came out to Death Valley because his health was failing him and the dry desert air was better for him and stuff. And he hit up this great friendship with Death Valley Scotty. And suddenly, after they had this friendship, here's Johnson on the left and Death Valley Scotty on the right. They suddenly decided to build this like multi-million-dollar super mansion in the northern part of Death Valley. And it's huge. And they never completed it, actually. These are like the plans. I mean, this thing is some kind of Hearst Castle or something like that. I mean, and it is really out in the middle of the desert. Today, it's a tourist spot. You can go there and see it. This is part of it. It was going to have all these swimming pools and stuff like that. It was this giant residence. And the story goes that, well, this guy, Al Johnson, just decided to just blow all the money he had somehow. And he later he lost a lot of it, his money. He had been like some millionaire in Chicago, but after the Depression, he wasn't. But for some reason, allegedly, he supposedly just financed this whole giant project, only with his money. And that Scotty was, and this is what they'll tell you if you go to Scotty's castle now, that Scotty was just this storyteller who told a lot of fables and tall tales, and amused people with his many stories, but they were all fiction. And his stories of this underground world and the Death Valley and all the gold and everything that he talked about was all just a story. But but he claimed, of course, it was true. And in my mind, there's a lot of evidence that, what he was saying was true, and he had access to this gold. But it's back to the same thing with Doc Noss and the treasure at the Victorio Peak. When you found some cache of gold ingots and gold artifacts and maybe a bunch of mummies are associated with, you're actually in big trouble. You're maybe going to prison, rather than living it up with all your gold treasure you found, because this is what happens. And I can tell you right now, in a lot of countries, like in South America, if you were to go out and find some Inca treasure or something, you're going to jail, I mean, that's how strict the laws are in those countries. So Scotty's castle was this, bizarre super mansion. And even in the Los Angeles Times, because Scotty had been caught in some hoaxes and mines that he had claimed he had, but it seems like what was really behind it all was this secret cache of ancient gold treasure that was somehow associated with this ancient civilization, whatever it was, that had been around Death Valley. So they called Scotty the Sphinx. He was this enigma and part of the enigma was where he got his money, how he was able to dupe rich people into giving him millions of dollars to, build castles out in the middle of the desert and stuff like that. So I honestly believe that, Scotty was smarter than he appeared, knew what he was saying, even though he told many tall tales and you couldn't really trust exactly what he said. He really, underneath the surface, there was really something there. So this is the guy who designed the powerhouse. You can kind of see how, finely built this was. I mean, this was really old world style building. They even at Scotty's castle had this state-of-the-art super power plant and everything that was in it that powered the whole castle around there. I mean, it's really, really incredible. And even today, as I say, this is a tourist spot. This is a rare picture of Scotty with his mules, and he's in Death Valley, crossing the valley to some secret spot, and he would go out by himself. Like a lot of old prospectors and miners and stuff, very secretive, paranoid that people would follow him where he was going, keeping it to himself. The same thing with the Lost Dutchman mine and superstitions. The Lost Dutchman would go some roundabout way, and take people, because people were following him all the time. And, so he'd take off over there when he was really going that way, and stuff like that. So, what is the reality about this? Now, a lot of these things in my Lost Cities books and stuff is constantly fighting with the experts who are archaeologists or they're geologists or whatever, and trying to figure out what's going on. So here we go. This is a bunch of the lake systems, and these are all ancient lakes that were around Death Valley. The lake in Death Valley was called Lake Manly. These other lakes, Searles Lake, Owens River, and these valleys, one of the lakes was called Lake Mannix, Soda Lake, but they all connected here. And geologists know this. I mean, they've been able to map out the ancient lakes and stuff of California. But the problem is with the geologists, they're saying, those lakes were, just 50,000 years ago, 100 100,000 years ago, not any times, in contemporary times. But that seems to be wrong. Scotty, too, was able to, one of the things he did to give him credibility, he ran a special engine from Los Angeles to Chicago that was a special train run, that was a luxury train. It broke the speed record for going from Los Angeles to Chicago. They called it the Scott Special. I mean, he was a guy who did a lot of stuff and a big mover and shaker, and he had big ideas. And when they built Scotty's Castle, yeah, it was this giant thing. Also around Death Valley is the what they call the racetrack playa, where these rocks move through the desert. This is pretty much what it's like around Death Valley, and this is actually a fairly high altitude up there. You need a real four-wheel drive to get up into this area. But here at this one dried out lake, and it too is a dried lake, that's what's so much all around Death Valley is ancient lakes that are just dried up and gone. But yeah, these rocks move around, and you see they fall off these cliffs over here, and you can see a bunch of them there. But then as you walk out onto the dry lake bed, there's just all of this evidence. You can just see even the trails of these rocks moving. And the forest rangers, they have a little plaque there. And one of the weird parts about it is that no one has ever seen these rocks move. They know they move, but no one's ever seen it. And which I thought was kind of baffling. You would think some park rangers would, they camp up there, and they're up there and stuff like that. But no one's ever seen them move. They believe, the standard theory is that when it's after a storm and the lake gets a little bit wet and maybe a little ice on it, and then it's super windy, suddenly, the wind moves these stones. But one of the strange things about them is that they move in like weird S shapes and even curlicues. They move in sort of oddball ways. So eventually, with Scotty and the gold and all the stuff in Death Valley, the newspapers constantly, particularly in California, were going on about Scotty, his mysterious gold mine, where did he get his money, all this. Eventually he died, like 1952. He died. He was like front page of the paper and stuff like that after kicking the bucket. And so a lot of stuff of Death Valley, it all sort of died at that time with him. And now Scotty's Castle is actually part of it became like a trust with a Presbyterian church. Now, right in the same area is a place called the Calico Dig. And this Calico site is near where Lake Mannix was. And this is an archaeological site. And in fact, even Louis Leakey, the famous anthropologist whose work in the Olduvai Gorge and Kenya and stuff, he was considered, like the top, anthropologist on really ancient man and stuff like that. He got involved in this site too, and it's called the Calico site. And in fact, here's a map of it right now. This is kind of like just south of Death Valley in California. And what happened with the Calico site was really strange because there's Leakey here. That it's associated with these dried lakes, and this one Lake Mannix. And so they found all of these like Clovis points and arrowheads and things like this all around it, hundreds of thousands of chipped arrowheads and stuff like that, and clearly all around this lake. But then again, the geologist said, well, there's a problem here. This lake hasn't been here for 100,000 years. But now, Leakey and all these other anthropologists and coming from San Diego, they're saying, yeah, people were living around this lake when it was a lake. And the geologists then were saying, yeah, but that's 100,000 years ago, and there weren't people here then. And this is what they call the Clovis barrier. And you get it, it is still dogma today, although it's being pushed out, and that is that all Native Americans walked, the Bering Land Bridge, walked down through Canada, walked all the way down to South America, and that was only like 12,000 years ago, or maybe 15,000 years ago. So if people were just coming to North and South America 15,000 years ago, there couldn't be anyone living around this lake 100,000 years ago. There can't be. I mean, that would utterly, totally upset the whole dogma of North American archaeology. And people involved were top paleontologists, Leakey and people like that. So here was the solution. The solution is that these aren't artifacts. That they're just rocks. And all the arrowheads and spear points and everything they found all around this lake. And if you can go there today, and the rangers will tell you, well, yeah, they thought they were arrowheads. They thought they were spearheads. Nah, they're just a bunch of rocks. They were lying around an ancient seabed, you know. So that's the story here. So you can kind of see how California has changed a lot, how it was so much wetter. And, you know, what I maintain is that the Southwest and Southern California especially has been drying up for thousands of years, and it still is today, getting drier and drier. This was another thing that was found in that same area, the Cusco artifact, which was found in the Inyo Mountains just north of Death Valley. And this is your spark plug in a geode. And when they x-rayed it and stuff like this, they found these machine metal parts in it and things, and the closest thing they could find to this thing was that it was like a modern spark plug. And it too was found, like these giants that were found near Death Valley and stuff like that, this is also one of the things. Also around, right along near Blythe, California, along the Arizona, California border, these intaglios, which also need to be seen from the air in like the Nazca Plain and stuff like that. Also kind of figures and things like that. So just weird stuff in the desert here. All right, so Mount Shasta too, which is sort of the northern part of what would have been this California inland sea, which would have included Death Valley. And even these lakes went all the way up into Nevada. And apparently, as far as I can tell, these lakes were there even just, even when the Spanish got there, there was still remnants of these lakes going on. All right, I'm gonna stop right now, and I'm gonna change PowerPoints, and I'll take a drink, and I'm checking the time. I'm gonna have just enough time to run to the gods. And I'll run through it pretty quick. Well, first, we'll talk briefly about Atlantis. We will go to South America. We'll see some Olmec stuff. And then hopefully, if we have time, we'll look at the special, the obelisks and the Tesla stuff. Let's see, here goes. Okay. One of the things I talk about in Technology of Gods in all my books is the world before our own, ancient technology, Atlantis, we could call it, and the whole idea that there's been advanced civilizations like ours in the past. They've had electricity, metals, flight. Even they do things, and we're able to do things that we're even unable to do today. The story of Atlantis comes from the Greek philosopher Plato. Plato tells the story in two of his dialogues. And he says that the story of Atlantis is coming from the ancient Egyptians. His uncle, who was a Greek statesman, had gone to Egypt, where Egyptian priests told him, hey, you Greeks don't even know your own history. Greece is a much older country than you even know. And then they proceed to tell him the story of Atlantis, how Atlantis fought a battle with the Mediterranean, stuff like that. Atlantis is supposedly beyond the Pillars of Hercules, out in the central Atlantic, perhaps here in the Caribbean area, Bimini and stuff. Even this whole area of the Yucatan and could be Atlantis. Atlantis has been placed all over the world, by the way, on the Sahara Desert in Indonesia. More books have been written about Atlantis, supposedly, than any other subject. Atlantis was a concentric circle kind of port city where you entered into concentric locks and things like that, And eventually you got into a inner core, inner area of the city of Atlantis. There was supposedly a big mountain to the north of Atlantis. Here's the concentric circles going into Atlantis. Carthage in Tunisia was kind of a miniature version of Atlantis. There's also a place in Mexico that's like that too, Calititlan. The idea too of Mu and Lemuria, the South America being down, Amazonian Sea, Atlantis, James Churchward, who did the Lost Colony of Mu books. This is the only side scan sonar photo that we know of that it's 2,000 feet off of Cuba. It was done by a Canadian-Russian bathysphere kind of robotic sub type of expedition. And what they claimed they found was kind of grid-like streets and pyramids underwater. I mean, they felt it was real structures underwater off Cuba, but 2,000 feet off Cuba. You have other, like Bimini in the Bahamas. In this area, you have these pillow-shaped rocks and things like that. This is actually a relatively shallow area, only like about 30 feet or something like that. Other sunken cities are all over the world. There's over 200 known sunken cities in the Mediterranean. Even maps of the Mediterranean, they know there's areas off Egypt right now where they're excavating Egyptian cities that are underwater in the Mediterranean, like 30 kilometers and stuff out. So the whole idea of ruins underwater is, and again, we know that they weren't built underwater, these ruins, so it would be that cataclysmic changes have completely inundated these areas, brought other land up high while it sunk other land with cities and stuff like that. This is all the Yonaguni site that's off of Okinawa in southern Japan. Mainstream archaeologists have been saying for years that the oldest ruins in the world were in Malta at 9,000 years old. And in fact, the whole area of the Mediterranean was like a lake system, and it was also like Death Valley in a sense, that it was below sea level, but it was like a desert with a bunch of lakes. This is what the Mediterranean looks like, and Malta would have been right over in here. And there's evidence that what happened was that the whole Mediterranean was hit by a giant, massive tidal wave that filled in the Mediterranean and made all these cities underwater, and there might be even more, and even filled in the Black Sea and stuff over here. And that this would have happened maybe at the time of Atlantis and the sinking of it. The largest stone blocks in the world, and something that very much interests me, is megalith building, the moving and building with giant megalithic blocks and stuff like that. So you have those at Baalbek. This is actually the unfinished obelisk at Aswan. Obelisks 2 are monolithic granite structures, towers. I mean, they weigh 100, even up to 1,000 tons, some of these things. They're gigantically huge. The largest known cut stone blocks that were used for building are at Baalbek in Lebanon. And some of these weigh like 1,000 tons. And you have, I mean, giant railway car-sized blocks of stone. Now, how are you going to move that? And even today, I mean, as archaeologists look at this as one of the most baffling things. Why are ancient people trying to build with these giant blocks of stone? We wouldn't try and do that today. But clearly they did. And they moved these things. They built them up. They stacked these giant things up. They have to have some explanation for it. They have to say, well, yeah, I mean, here's how they might have done it. We don't know how. The way they try and explain it now is that they put little small hourglass cuts into the top of the block so that a kind of hourglass-shaped stone can then slip inside it like a pulley, and then that can have, those stones can then be attached to pulleys, and that's what's going on here. And you built a giant cage around this, railway car-sized block of stone. You have these little pulleys. You pull it up. I mean, you're trying to move a 1,000-ton block of granite. And after you do all that, you can move it a few inches. Then you start all over again, and you start doing that. I mean, it's impossibly difficult to move these things. And you've just got to ask yourself, you still can't figure out how they really did it, because it couldn't have been like this. And why? I mean, really the answer is that it would have to be easy for them. They would have been able to do it without it being so difficult, which is what is so hard for us to conceive. This is from an old National Geographic here. This is what they call keystone cuts and clamps, where you have blocks of stone like this that are fitted together, and then these clamps, which are molten metals, are poured into these slots. And this is an unusual way of fitting megalithic blocks, but this is a good illustration. We're going to see some more of this later. The whole idea, too, that the Sphinx is over 10,000 years old, and right next to the Sphinx is this building called the Temple building of Khephren, the Valley Temple of Khephren, as they call it. And it's a megalithic building, and it has here, notice how the notchings of the stones and stuff like that, kind of a polygonal sort of construction. In southern Egypt is this place called the Osirion at Abydos. It's actually pre-Egyptian ruins, and in fact, the Egyptians built a temple next to it. It was underwater, actually, and the Egyptian government spent years pumping water out of this because it was in a swamp trying to get the water out, and they're still doing it today. And it's megalithic construction, no hieroglyphs or anything like that on it. The notching, you can see also how blocks are notched and stuff together. Also these curious little knobs and things like that. They don't know what those are for. And this is really super fine megalithic construction, as good as anywhere in the world. You can see the water and stuff like that. So now we're in the Andes Mountains. We're in Cusco, Peru. This is the famous stone of 12 angles. Actually appears on the Cusqueña beer label that they make in Cusco. So this is what's on the label. They call it the stone of 12 angles. You also see these notches and stuff like that. A lot of the jigsaw polygonal construction particularly that you see in Peru is really fine. It's the most advanced stone construction that we know because the blocks of stone are locked in together like a jigsaw. And that's why you have all these little corners and weird shapes, because when you're building with the uniform kind of like square rectangular shape, like bricks or cinder blocks or something, they'll shear in an earthquake. But these kind of blocks are locked together. And when a massive earthquake hits these walls, they jumble, but they move together and they're locked in. This wall, also just like walls in Cusco and other areas of Peru, this is at the Emperor's Palace in Tokyo, okay? And it's the same kind of megalithic, polygonal locking in of the blocks and stuff like that. This is a megalithic building. This is another megalithic building built out of the polygonal blocks of stone locked in together. And this one is in Greece. This is what they call the Necromanticon. It's up in northwest Greece near Albania. And in fact, it wasn't even found until the 1960s because it was underground. They had to dig it out. And then here's all this, again, locked in, very, very old, but these polygonal blocks, old in jigsaw patterns, locked in together. We're back in Cusco again. We're looking out over this, the Cusco Valley. This is the Saqsaywaman fortress on a hill above Cusco. It too is these giant polygonal blocks fitted together. Looks like what the Emperor's Palace in Tokyo or some of these other things. It's totally megalithic in nature. Machu Picchu is also a megalithic city. Machu Picchu is a city that's on top of a mountain. It's a secret city. It is megalithic. This is famous window of, they call it a wall of three windows. Megalithic blocks, like a lot of big lichen patches. Here you see these blocks here too, also notched and stuff like that. But look up here at the top. Here you see kind of crummy building too, but it's also ancient, but it's not nearly so fine as what you see below. This is also a Machu Picchu. This is megalithic, perfectly constructed walls and things like that. More megalithic walls at Machu Picchu. Really, really finely fitted together, like this one too is also a Machu Picchu. Big lichen patches and stuff like that. We don't even know what this wall was or what it did. It was part of some structure. We don't know. One of the most interesting places in Peru is this place, Ollantaytambo, where you have a sun temple up here, and we're about to go up here in a second. You go up these terraces, and you get up into this area where the sun temple is. You're going up. You go up these stairs. Once again, the polygonal blocks, these curious knobs, like we saw at Abydos in Egypt and stuff like that. We don't know what that's for. Finely made granite. Perfectly cut and articulated. Whenever you have these inside corners and stuff like that, that's very difficult to do. There's evidence that these are machined and actually cut by saws and things like that. More again, these polygonal blocks put together. You're coming around, there's one of the doorways, inside corners. But once again, you see, again, this like kind of crummy building up on top. See, it's clear that who's building this wall down here and that, they're not going to build like that. This is something else. But as you get up to the top, you start seeing some really unusual things. These giant blocks are just lying around, and it's like some kids' building block toys are just scattered around. You see this, which is this main wall. This is kind of the main thing you see, this one huge wall with these very unusual narrow strips of granite in here. But as you go around the corner, you see how this is like a lintel that's fallen. These things would be sockets for other giant blocks to fit in and stuff like that. And then as you go around the side, you see also huge blocks like this. And here it is, and here it's notched right here and coming down. But it's filled in here with this crummy rubble. And so clearly, I mean, the builders who are building with these giant blocks of stone, I mean, this block is going to have another huge megalithic block perfectly fitted into it. But that's not what's there. Instead, there's just this crummy rubble. Now, mainstream archaeologists, here's what they say. They're saying, yeah, this all was built like 200 years before the Spanish got there. I mean, that recent. And the Incas dragged this giant 1,000-ton block of granite up this hill, got here, notched it like this, and then they filled it in with this crummy rubble. You know, I mean, this is what they're saying. Because the Incas, now, I mean, what's clear to me is that here's your Inca construction. I mean, the Incas are contemporary with the Spanish. I mean, and the Inca Empire had only started a few hundred years before the Spanish got there. Here's Inca construction. This is like Atlantean construction, and it's part of something else, something that was destroyed, something that was never finished or completed. I mean, here's what it looks like right now, these blocks like that. It looks like this today. It looked like this when the Spanish got there. And it looked like this in Inca times too, just like this, because they can't move these blocks. They can't do anything with them. Even today, the modern Peruvian government couldn't bring cranes and stuff here and you know, move these blocks and restack them or something. There's no way they could do anything with it. And it's up on top of this mountain. This whole area, you can see, particularly on Ollantaytambo, is, in my mind, utter proof that the Incas didn't build this stuff, that's all way pre-Inca, and this stuff is thousands of years old and couldn't really be duplicated. And here you go with the keystone cuts. You go here, and you have what are called these keystone cuts. Okay, this is a T-shaped cut. This is what we saw before. And then clamps, you have to have another block fitting into it, and there has to be another T here, and then you're going to pour molten metals into this. And this is a very unusual way of fitting giant blocks together. But that's what you see at Ollantaytambo, these weird keystone cuts and other things like that, other giant blocks around. The quarries up here across the Urubamba River, here's where these blocks are from. They're quarried up here, and even you have these giant blocks of granite, and they're like railway cars, and then they were moved down and over the river. In Peru, this is actually a Landsat satellite of this area right here. This kind of looks like egg heart shaped. It's supposed to be 8 pyramids in the jungles of Peru that have never really been explored. Expeditions have gone in here, vanished, never came back. Peruvian military has flown into this area with helicopters and stuff like that, flown around it. It's a really remote area of eastern Peru. As you get up towards Lake Titicaca, you see other megalithic buildings, what they call the chulpos of Silustani, and then this weird Stargate thing that is this door carved into solid rock along it's along the west side of Lake Titicaca as you're driving towards what would be Bolivia. This thing's about 40 feet high. You go up to it. They call it the Devil's Door, the door of Amaru Muru. People claim to have interdimensional experiences here. Some say it's a Stargate or something like that. And actually, the Egyptians did stuff like this too, where they created false doors. This one is at Giza in Egypt. This one is in a temple in Egypt at Dendera, like just doors that don't go anywhere. They're carved into solid rock and stuff like that. There's a lot of UFO activity around Lake Titicaca. It's also the area of the Reed ships and stuff like that. There's underwater ruins and stuff around there. This lake, which is near Cusco actually, is called Waipo Laguna, Lake Waipo. It's a small lake, but this lake is very famous for UFO activity, and many people will tell you that oftentimes, like at 4 in the morning, UFOs come out of this lake, and that it's actually a shallow lake, and there's a village over here, but this lake has like a hole in the middle of it that's like bottomless. And supposedly, I haven't done it, you can go out and you can see this, or maybe it closes up. But yeah, allegedly UFOs come up out of the lake and then take off. And I've heard this from many, many people, including also just villagers who live around there, and I've talked to them. So allegedly, there's a lot of UFO activity around Lake Titicaca, including UFOs that come up out of the water. Lake Titicaca is quite deep, too. There are ruins and things like that in Lake Titicaca, underwater megalithic things. And one of the strange things about Lake Titicaca, too, is that it has a seahorse in it. And seahorses are from the ocean. Why Lake Titicaca now is at nearly 13,000 feet in the Andes, and why there would be seahorses in Lake Titicaca has never been explained, and they can't figure that out. The famous Gate of the Sun at Tiwanaku, it too was locked in and fitted to other megalithic blocks and stuff like that. Today it just stands by itself. There's a lot of temples at Tiwanaku and weird statues. It was a hydrological area with these tunnels and stuff. In fact, you weren't supposed to take photos of this for some reason. They're just doing all these excavations now. But yeah, this is like underground, and there are these stone-cut tunnels and things like that. It's possible that water was also running through all this, and it was like a huge hydrological area too, and probably metallurgical. This is the famous, also at Tiwanaku, is the famous Kon-Tiki statue of Thor Heyerdahl fame and Kon-Tiki. And what he's doing is very, very much the Tiki position of the hands, where hand is over your stomach and your heart, like this. And that's a very Tiki thing. If you go to Tahiti, New Zealand, and stuff like that, and you buy little tikis and stuff, that's always what they do is this. So, and he's Kon-Tiki, and this is, of course, high in the mountains of South America. He's bearded and has a mustache and like that as well. And American Indians don't actually have facial hair and beards usually. There was a huge pyramid there too that had a lake on top of it. The Spanish destroyed it looking for treasure. But this too was a hydrological thing where they had to have like ram pumps that rammed water up to this lake basin, and then it came back down, washing the ores and things like that. Near to Tiwanaku is this, what they call the Pumapunku area of giant blocks, also just, it's been destroyed. And again, what do you have? More of these keystone cuts and these little hourglass things. Same ones, and now this is, they know is pre-Inca. I mean, Tiwanaku's easily 2,000 years old, if not many more. Archaeologists say it's about 2,000 years ago. So here's your keystone cuts. This was not built by the Incas, and this is basically proof that the Incas, too, didn't build Cusco or Machu Picchu or Ollantaytambo or any of that area, but they occupied those cities because they're giant megalithic cities. They're still standing there. So as you go through around Tiwanaku, you're going to see a lot of these keystone cuts. Molten metals are poured into those things. They're gone now. You can see how, too, like here, mud and muck just buried much of the city. And then here again, more keystone cuts where clamps would be in here. I had to dig these out. This area too, this is, you can see how just these blocks of stone and stuff are sitting on these like pillars of mud and muck. It's like some giant tidal wave hit this place, wiped it out, destroyed it, tumbled it all over, and then, buried it in mud and muck. And even today, archaeologists are still, just now, starting to dig into it. Here's what one of the clamps would look like in the stones, actual metal clamp poured in there. Now we're back in Egypt, okay? These are keystone cuts in Egypt at the Luxor Temple. So the Egyptians were building like this too. This is a really unusual way of building. It's not how people would normally build. And when you're building with giant megalithic blocks, you wouldn't really think they were going anywhere anyway. This wall right here has a bunch of keystone cuts on it, only this wall's been totally reconstructed. It's at Edfu in Egypt. Yeah, this was not ever like this. I mean, not one of these keystone cuts, and here's like one, it's this a block from somewhere else, and they just created this wall. So we'll run through a few more things. This is also a Tiwanaku. These guys are Tiwanakos with their beards and mustaches. This guy, very Chinese looking, he's a Tiwanaku guy. And you've also got these conehead guys with these elongated craniums. And some of these guys look really, really weird. With some of their craniums are like double the capacity that a normal human would have. The Olmecs also in Mexico had this too. This is what these guys look like in Mexico. They had this deformed craniums and stuff like that. We don't really know why they did this or what they were doing. They might have been trying to imitate extraterrestrials or something like that, or we know it was the royalty were doing that. They were maybe trying to just double their cranial capacity so that they could somehow be more psychic, have bigger brain power. There are ways to do this. But with small infants, before the plates in your head have fused and stuff like that, you can press and bind the head together, and you can smash the head. You can make it long. And we know there are ways to do this, and in fact, the Egyptians did this too. And Akhenaten and Nefertiti, even Tutankhamun, Meritaten. This is actually one of the daughters of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. She had the elongated head. This is Tutankhamun, a statue. He was also a cone head as well. People were doing this in the Congo, Pacific Islands. This too is a really unusual thing to do, to do this binding, to elongate the head and stuff like that. Really, to have high technology like we do today, you need to have good sanitation and water and stuff like that. But you need electricity, you need machines, you need metals. And then you can have flight. They had that, or I maintain. We know they had ancient electricity, like the Baghdad battery. We know that. They used it for electroplating and stuff like that. This is the Antikythera device, which was found in a shipwreck off Greece. It was a computer. It actually had a date. It was built in Rhodes, but it too was a complicated machine that had all these cogged wheels and stuff like that. And in fact, once it was studied in the 1950s, they said they couldn't believe that ancient people had anything like this and ever would have made stuff like that. And they said that this was like finding a jet airplane in King Tut's tomb, which eventually they found something like that. But yeah, the idea that, and the way you look at the past was, and they just assumed, well, they never had anything like that. Well, they did. They had complicated machines. They had electricity. They had... this is also at Dendera. This is this famous thing that's totally real. These cables are coming out of these bulbs and stuff like that. These JED columns here, they're connected to this box. It's like ancient Egyptian temples were lit by some kind of electricity and stuff like that. And the idea that they would add heavy machinery. This is actually a zoomorphic pendant found in Panama. This is also real. And what it appears to be is, and it's actually just a gold artifact. And by the way, all gold from ancient times still exists today. Gold is indestructible. And other metals and stuff like that will oxidize, not gold. But gold is too soft to really be used much for machines. It can be used in electronics a little bit. But this thing, what it appears to be, is actually a zoomorphic glyph or pendant of like a backhoe and some heavy machinery. And just like today, we need bulldozers, backhoes, graders, heavy machinery in order to have a really a high-tech world in ancient times and to do some of the stuff they also would want and probably would make heavy machinery. And that's apparently what this thing was. And so this is what it kind of looks like, and here's what it would be as a kind of a backhoe, because it has its blades and things like that. So it was basically heavy machinery that they turned into a monster and into a piece of jewelry, ultimately. Also, nearby in Colombia was the famous Colombian gold airplanes that they were, they're gold, and they were like these model Delta jets. And they look like airplanes. Again, archaeologists have to explain this, and their explanation is, well, these are flying fish, because they can't be airplanes. So they have to be something else, a flying fish, or something like that. They found a glider also. There's this thing here, also in Egypt, where it looks like a helicopter, and this thing looking like a jet plane. Ancient people had lots of stories of flight, including King Solomon going to visit the Queen of Sheba. Assyrian cylinders. Here you have a winged disc, okay, a disc with wings. Here these guys are sitting in it. They're flying places. When you read the Mahabharata and the ancient Hindu epics and stuff like that, they read like the wildest science fiction. People are flying around in their vimanas, blasting each other, devastating whole cities and stuff like that. And in fact, when they started in the late 1940s and 50s, British and Indian and Pakistani archaeologists began excavating Mohenjo-daro and Harappa and cities like that. And just like the ancient Hindu epics had indicated, people were lying dead in the streets. It's like this doom had taken over the city, and no one had buried the dead or anything. And for thousands of years, they just, the desert came in, buried this city until archaeologists just recently came back. And and this was not something they expected to find, just people lying dead in the streets of these cities. Something had just wiped them all out and killed them. The whole idea of Vimanas, of Rama, and these guys are flying around, they have their chariots. Every Hindu and Buddhist knows that. The story of Rama goes down to save his wife down in Sri Lanka. He's up here in the Ayodhya forest. His wife Sita leaves him basically for another guy. He goes out, he's bummed out, he goes and meditates for a while, and then he finally decides, hey, I'm going to go and get her back, and he jumps in his airship, flies down there, has a big argument with her, tells her to come home with him. That's kind of what the Ramayana is all about. And interestingly, too, that here in Sri Lanka and ancient India, recent satellite photos are showing what they call Rama's Bridge. And it is this apparently man-made causeway that's going from southern India to Sri Lanka, all right? And this is underwater, but this would have been something like Key West, driving out to, the Florida Keys along that road. And it just going along the ocean, then finally you get to Key West and stuff like that. But this is underwater right now, and ships go through it. But with satellite photography, they're able to show this thing, this ancient, apparently, road that's going through. And when you read the Ramayana, it talks about ancient airships and these vimanas, but when you read a normal, like a novel or some story, and the hero suddenly goes to the airport and gets on a plane and flies to London or something, the author doesn't stop and say, oh, this is what an airplane is. It has wings, it has 4 engines, there's seats, and stewardesses will give you drinks. They don't say that. They know you know. And that's how the ancient Indian epics were. They'd talk about vimanas, but they wouldn't go into detail about them because, well, you knew what a vimana was. But then they found this entire book in the Royal Baroda Library in 1909, and then in 1923 they started translating. It was a book only about these aircraft and the vimanas and stuff like that. There was 4 kinds of vimanas. Some kinds were circular, some were tubular, cigar-shaped. Others had wings and were like a normal airplane. They talked about Mercury being part of the system of the vimanas and stuff like that. Mercury's the messenger god. There's an idea, too, of what they call Mercury vortex engines and things like that, of what they call plasma vortex and wheels in wheels. And one of the early airships and stuff like that came from the 1800s, also were similar to like vimanas. Tesla also had a whole a system that had to do with broadcasting power. I'm just getting to that. And I'll wind it up. I've just got 2 more minutes here. With Tesla and his death rays and this whole thing of these towers that he was building, he was going to broadcast energy, actually. And these anti-gravity airships that were like Vimanas, they would be, Tesla's towers would be broadcasting this power. These airships would be drawing power from his airships. This guy's the greatest inventor who ever lived. I mean, right now, this building and buildings all over the world are lit by his inventions. This is what he wanted to do. He died in the 40s. The FBI tore this tower down. He was building these prototype towers and stuff like that. But now a group in California called the Lemurian Fellowship, they said that in Atlantis were also these similar towers like Tesla. They called them Max Towers, and they were these giant monolithic crystal towers. And these towers, they claimed, broadcast power in the atmosphere just like Tesla said he was going to do. Well, these things exist, and they're called obelisks. Okay, and obelisks are monolithic crystal towers. I mean, because if they need to be built out of granite, they are crystals, and they're cut like a tuning fork. They're certain sizes, they vibrate at certain things, and Egyptologists do not know what obelisks were really for. They're supposedly the ray of a sun, okay? Except they weigh, 500 tons. And to erect them, to put them places and stuff like that, it's very difficult. Even an obelisk was found off here in Lake Ontario underwater. This is an interesting story that I taught. And even, get this, there's a place on the moon called the Blair Cuspids, and it is obelisks. And this is what it looks like. The Russians really got into this, and it's known as the Blair Cuspids. And essentially, the Blair Cuspids is a series of obelisks on the moon. How about that? And that would be going to Tesla's broadcasting of power, to what was supposedly this Atlantean system of also broadcasting power around the world. And that apparently, at one time, 10,000 years ago or something, obelisks were all over the world. And even Tiwanaku supposedly also had an obelisk in front of it. So I know I've gone past my time, so thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Everyone loves a mystery. One of the greatest mysteries of the past is the enigma of the great megalith builders. How were they able to build these giant structures? Why do similar megalithic structures appear all over the world? Did the ancients build these structures with primitive tools, or did they use some sort of highly developed technology similar to our own? Modern-day explorer and researcher David Hatcher Childress is founder of the World Explorers Club, a group dedicated to uncovering the mysteries of past civilizations. David has been fascinated by the enigma of the megalith builders and the methods they may have used, whether ingeniously simple or highly complicated.
I expect to find in Peru the answers to some of the many enigmas of the megalithic engineering that's found in the Andes Mountains.
What has
really struck me about the sites in Peru, at Tiahuanaco, Machu Picchu, is the enormous stonework that the ancients actually created. I've been fascinated with it. I'm absolutely enamored with Machu Picchu.
On previous trips to Peru, I have seen what are amazing enigmas with giant megalithic blocks perfectly cut and articulated, what seems to be high-tech engineering far beyond what the ancient Incas were capable of doing.
In order to search out the answers to the enigma of the megalith builders around the world, David has decided to enlist the help of British engineer Christopher Dunn, a specialist in modern machining techniques.
The conventional theory of how the ancients cut stone and created these artifacts is the use of copper chisels or copper implements, to use sand, bone, or wood, or actually use another stone and bash the rock. These methods just do not fit the evidence and cannot create those artifacts the way they were created. It's impossible to do that.
My first impression was, with very little historical background, that all this was done by hand. It was lapping and chiseling and took many hours, days, weeks. But after looking at some of the granite that I've seen, I question if it was even feasible to do by hand. And it kind of leads me into directions of thinking about the application of machine tools some time ago. There's multiple aspects involved here. Step one is, how do you cut this stuff thousands of years ago? How and with what? And then once you get it cut, for whatever reason, they've got precise corner breaks and fillet radiuses down lengths that are unexplained, but they obviously had something to inspect these characteristics, to assure things were parallel, to assure they were perpendicular. And that goes out into another branch that, just gets people thinking.
With the help of Christopher Dunn, David is determined to fly to Peru and take Chris to some of the megalithic sites in the Andes that he is familiar with, to see what evidence of ancient high technology that they might be able to find. Along the way, we may learn some interesting historical facts concerning the mysteries of South American culture. All aboard for Peru! In the central Andes of Peru, David and Chris arrive in the ancient city of Cusco. It was used as the capital of the Inca Empire, which began around 900 AD and lasted until the Spanish conquest in 1531. But is Cusco really a city that predates the Incas by thousands of years?
As we go around and we see places, we'll be advancing the theory that Incas didn't build these walls and that they were already here in Inca times. Incas lived in these buildings, but they didn't build them. They were already standing here. This is the most famous stone in Cusco. It's the stone of the 12 angles. It's the stone that appears on the Cusco beer. And to a lot of people, this is like the symbol of Cusco, this stone particularly.
On a hill above Cusco can be found the massive walls of Saqsaywaman, an edifice of imposing walls built with gigantic blocks of limestone that are perfectly fitted together. It is one of the most imposing sights in all of South America.
And one of the questions that you have to ask is why would anybody go to such extreme effort to build with such giant stones? It's not necessary. I mean, they could be building with much smaller stones, but here they're building with giant stones, and it's...
Well, they didn't have to put in as much effort as we would, that's why.
I think that's it. Yeah, and so the reason why they are building with such giant stones is because it was easy for them, not because it was hard.
Yeah.
This is a particularly unique rock here, and many people think that it has to do with the Kundalini serpent energy that's taught in ancient India, and that this whole figure here is of a snake, and we see pictures of snakes carved in the stones in Cusco. This one is particularly unusual because it's very deep and large, carved into this granite, and then you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 chakras. It's thought that this corresponds to the Kundalini energy in your spine going up through your chakras here. What we find right here at the seat of the Inca, here at Saqsaywaman, is that this seat right here is magnetized. And by bringing our compass along these stones right here, the compass is spinning. So there's a curious magnetic anomaly right here, some strong magnetic field that's either naturally in the rock or has somehow been artificially placed here. It's possible that this magnetic field actually has something to do with the moving of these giant stones.
We're looking at a processes or machine tools or tool bits anyway that's common to the builders of this facility, for want of a better word, the builders of this site, and what they were doing in Egypt.
If this was actually carved by a glacier that was smoothing it out, you have to wonder why you're going to have these rough parts here. If there had been a glacier actually carving this, it would have smoothed out this entire stone. And you wouldn't have these rough nods like this. You just wouldn't.